It's 4:01, and I'd like to greet everyone, say welcome to SA Child, welcome to our webinar. This is, I think, our first webinar that we're having around hearing and hearing impairments, and I'm delighted that you can join us. My name is Gillian, and I'm the chairperson of SA Child. For those of you who aren't familiar, this is the first time you have joined. SA Child stands for the Southern African Academy of Childhood Disability, and it's an organization that is part of the International Alliance of Academies. So the academies throughout the world and through in different regions, and we are the Southern African Academy, and the academy links together educators, professionals, people with lived experience, anyone who has an interest in children in childhood onset disability. Childhood onset disability is, we also have a lifespan approach. So it's anyone with a childhood onset disability, and we have a look at what happens as they grow older. And we are interested in saying, what can we do to ensure that anybody with a childhood onset disability is living the best quality of life possible. And how we can do that is by joining hands. So this is a platform where we have everyone, people, families, people with lived experience, as well as professionals, joining in on one platform to listen and to learn from one another. So it is a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker for this afternoon, Professor Claudine Storbeck. Claudine was on our executive committee, and she was also one of our founding members. So she's been with us for the first 3 years, very much part of the founding of the organization, and she was also our treasurer. So I'm so glad, Claudine, that you are back, and this time to share your vast knowledge and expertise. Claudine's passion is ensuring that all children with hearing loss have equal access to education and equal opportunities to develop their full potential. After graduating in the fields of both teaching and psychology, Claudine's postgraduate research was in the field of educational linguistics and deaf education. Claudine started a Department of Specialized Education at WITS in 1998, and she is the current director of the center. In 2006, she established High Hopes, which is the first home-based early intervention program for families with a deaf infant. And today's topic, I asked Claudine if she could tell us about newborn screening, how it's done, why is it important, and is this a program that is possible to roll out to all newborn children throughout, not just South Africa, but Southern Africa. And also, well, once you've identified there's a hearing problem, what do you do next? So Claudine, thank you so much for your time, and I hand over to you. If you want to ask questions during the presentation, please feel free to use the chat line. There's not very many of us here, which is great. There's a small group which allows for lots of interaction and participation. And I want to make sure that when the session ends, your questions have been answered. So Claudine, over to you. Thank you. Claudine, you're on mute. Okay. So Claudine, we could see your screen.
Oh, no, now the only way I could go off mute is to stop sharing. Let me start again.
Okay.
Okay, you can see me.
We can see you, we can see your screen, and we can hear you. Over to you.
Okay. Lovely. Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to be presenting, remembering that I'm not an audiologist, but I've been working in the field for 30 years. And I'll be referring a little bit to the Netcare newborn hearing screening program, of which I'm one of a huge group of people that are participating in it. And so some of the work that we're doing with Netcare, we can't yet talk about in a forum that can then be duplicated because it hasn't been published yet. It's in progress. So if there's anything that I show you in the screen relates to the Netcare program, I'm going to ask you just to respect that until it's published, and then you can actually reference it correctly. But I still do want to share that information with you. So welcome. Yeah, pop your questions in the notes section, and then Gillian will help make sure we answer that. I think the first thing that one always needs to think through is, so, you know, why do we want to learn this, and through which lens are we looking at? So bigger than just the medical model and social model is just to think, so what is the benefit of what we're doing and why we do it? And what is our lens? So medical model, or people in therapeutic, or a parent who just wants a child like them, looks at this and goes, well, I want to be able to do the screening to be able to identify as soon as possible so that I can prevent my child a life of suffering, or I can make life easier for them, or I want my child to be normal. I want my child to be normal. I don't want them to have anything wrong with them. And that's a good dream to have, but also just to be considering of, are we just wanting to fix? So there is such a benefit for newborn hearing screening and just newborn screening in general, which doesn't relate to deafness only, but there's so many other things which we can implement and apply this model to. But just to consider, like, why we do what we do, and the motivation behind that, and that when we talk to parents, because really it ultimately is about the parent with the deaf baby and the infant themselves, when we talk to parents about the value of newborn screening, let us always try and remember not to share our own bias or our own lens, because it really isn't, so that we can get the child as normal as possible, thereby instilling fear of what the child will potentially have or not have, because we can never have that crystal ball and know that if we identify early, we can therefore intervene, and the child will then be speaking, hearing, and normal. So to just always be very aware of our biases. To remember now, in terms of what we're going to be looking at in newborn screening, we'll be looking at the different parts and different ways of newborn screening, and then just to remind ourselves of how the ear works. I'm looking away because I've got two screens here. One's got the PowerPoint and one's got the next slide. And so I'm not looking at the screen the whole time, but I am. I apologize. So we just want to remind ourselves that the ear is divided into three main parts. There's the outer ear, the middle ear, and the inner ear. And that thing we see, and those early hours and days when we do the newborn screening, those tiny little ears are going to then be touched and handled, and we'll learn soon that that conductive component of the tiny baba is then often filled with vernix, and something that we need to be aware of if we start thinking about implementing a newborn hearing screening program, because it cannot be prevented, and slowly but surely our moms are being discharged from hospital earlier and earlier, and sometimes now even within hours of giving birth, which will then impact very greatly onto the newborn screening. The middle ear obviously impacted by the liquids as well, and then the inner ear is the cochlea, and then it goes to the auditory nerve and then the brain stem, which is the inner part. And the different assessments and tests we do test different parts of the ear. And so very often we're asked to say, so which one is the best? Which one is better? But it really is quite different in terms of what they assess. Now, my favorite slide is coming up next. And I don't think that there is a presentation I can do without showing slides. So if you've seen it before, I do apologize. But this is one of the reasons we know that newborn screening, and I'm including everything now, and in particular newborn hearing screening, is important. Because if we look, that left black line at the 0 mark, that is moment of birth, okay? Moment of birth. So any of the lines that do not start at 0. So the lines that start at 0 are numbers and vision, and the red one, which is symbols. All the other lines start developing far earlier and therefore are almost at the peak or on the way to the peak at birth. One of which is the yellow line, which is hearing. And so when we look at that and go, why is this emergency to get newborn screening started? Well, it's because if the child has a hearing loss, they're already losing out on all the hearing that they could have had in utero. And that is extremely important. But at the same time, not something I'm going to impress upon a new mom who has then just had a little infant diagnosed with a hearing loss. But this is why we call it a medical and emergency, is newborn hearing screening is fundamental in the early language and brain development of the baby, which then has an impact in a far greater way. We also know that language impacts on many of the other areas here. For example, the language development, it is orange. Look at the language development curve. And then, of course, the emotional and social. Look at the emotional one. Emotional control also starts developing before birth. And so newborn hearing screening, other than what we know about early brain development after birth, the early work that Shonkoff is doing and Gorolnik is doing in terms of early identification and intervention and all the early stuff, this one here by Heckman really impacts me every time when we see how much is already happening almost from conception, which means by the time they are born, they're already 9 months life, which they potentially need to catch up on. So then, again, going back to, so that why early hearing screening? You know, if we're going to start screening, why don't we do other stuff? Well, they've already started doing some of the other screenings where they kind of look at the little leggies and they look at the genitalia and they do the heel prick for some kind of basic. But why should we start with hearing? You know, what is the significant impact of that? Why shouldn't we really invest all our money in CMV screening? Because CMV screening could tell us more, and it could also, you know, help us identify the reasons for more in-depth and more severe disabilities. So why hearing? You know, what's the big thing with hearing? And so we're just going to touch briefly on reminding ourselves that the impact of hearing has irreversible delays on language and speech and cognition and the psychosocial domains. I also want to make sure that you hear that I'm speech, because if we only worry about the speech development of a child, it really is just the production of language. So if a child can't speak and they have language, that's the most important thing. Not to say speech is important, but it's about the language, cognitive development, psychosocial domains, and of course speech. We know that late identification has irrevocable impact on education and vocation. Children that are late identified are 70% more probable of being unemployed going forward. Financial independence as an adult and social integration. Those are the long-term impacts. And of course, if all of that is in place, plus the irreversible delays of the language, cognition, and social emotional, these kids grow up without the possibility of truly equal and equitable education and futures, and really a very minimized quality of life that some would say even diminished. Let's also remember that we don't do for the family and then for society as a whole. My last apologies. Parents suffer very, very big degree of any disability, and in particular hearing. This impacts on bonding, communication, social emotional stuff, and all the additional things that it impacts. On the other side, there has been research, particularly in the UK, where they have said, well, if the child fails the newborn screening, but it's a false fail, it was a mistake, maybe because of liquid in the ear, the parent could potentially experience such grief and shock, post-traumatic stress, that actually it's not worth the newborn screening, because we don't want to give parents that additional stress and anxiety. In conversations with fellow South Africans and audiologists that work in newborn screening, we've spoken about it, and there's nothing written about it, but we have a sense, and most of us have spoken as South Africans, going, South Africans just don't seem to be that overly sensitive, that there is this huge risk of a family having such a shock and anxiety from the potential loss, the fail of the newborn hearing screening, that it outweighs the benefit. Because in some players are actually considering delaying newborn screening because it could potentially be outweighed by the negative impact of the grief and anxiety and worry if the child then fails the screening in the interim period between screening and diagnosis. So let us look, I just want to hop to here. So now when we look at newborn screening, there is what we call the early detection pathway. Now in hearing, it's the early hearing detection and intervention pathway, and you cannot have one pathway. And so to be able to say upfront, if you do not have intervention and support in place before you start the newborn screening, it is unethical to screen. You cannot help identify and diagnose disabilities without giving parents any type of support, intervention, and solutions and ways to habilitate, because when it's newborn, it's habilitation, not rehabilitation. And so we cannot even consider setting in place screening programs, investing money, getting donors to get involved, fighting and lobbying government, if there isn't a place to go and a way for us to support. And so I'm going to look now at the different ways that we can screen and test hearing. So the most popular type of screening is the otoacoustic emissions testing, and the most popular in terms of newborn hearing screening. There are two types of screening that are proposed on the international best practice for newborns at newborn screening. One is the OAE, and the other one is the ABR. Now, in terms of the OAE, I want to just have all my papers here so I can be totally sure. So it's a very quick and non-invasive way of testing, very easy to do on tiny little bubbies because they are sleeping and they are still. It is also really nice to be able to do it in a maternity ward because typically maternity wards are quieter. So this type of test requires a reasonably quiet room and a sleeping baba that is still, because any type of movement will then impact on the feedback one gets. So what this tiny little OAE does is there's a tiny little rubber probe. You pop it in the child's ear, one ear at a time, and it sends a signal beep, through go back to the ear. So it sends a signal through the ear canal, through the hearing pathway there, which is conductive, and then it measures what the echo is that comes back from the cochlea. Now, the frequency that goes out, the little beep, in addition to the sound that's potentially bouncing around, the echo that comes back from the cochlea is at a slightly different frequency. And so the machine is able to pick up that frequency echo back from the cochlea, and then it is able to then say whether the baby then passes or fails. It is very important to note for the OAE, the OAE is basically assessing the inner hair cells of the cochlea, the functioning of the inner hair cells of the cochlea. And when I look at the comparison between OAE and ABR, we'll look at the time and the investment of time so that we can kind of think of the cost ratio to time and which piece of equipment and which way you then decide to then pick up and do newborn hearing screening. So that's the OAE. Typically, in newborn hearing screening, there will also then be a second type of assessment, which is the ABR or the AABR. And the AABR works with electrodes, so it doesn't just send sound through the ear and measure it internally that way. It measures the how the brain responds to sound by placing electrodes on the little bubby. It's also painless. It's also uninvasive. And just get my piece of paper. And the child, what they call it, it's objective, so the child doesn't have to respond. Both OAE and ABR are objective. And what you can immediately see, there are electrodes, which means there is equipment that needs to be purchased typically for every child, so they're disposable. And these tests, when we compare the two, the AABR, and I've written this down because I was so surprised at the time differences. The time that the AABR takes to do on a newborn is approximately 12.5 minutes. So almost 13 minutes. Obviously, with side, 4 to 5 minutes, either way it can go. So that is an assessment that is expensive in terms of the time that needs to be invested in it, and the equipment is expensive. It also needs to be noted that, as with the OAE, the little bubby needs to be sleeping, but with the AABR, it is far more important that it's a deep sleep. And typically these little infants that do have an AABR are sedated. Whereas if one does an AABR with a newborn, really tiny little bubbies, they sleep really deeply as it is. So it's definitely something to consider if there is ever any suggestion of sedation, to rather not immediately embrace sedation and see if the child is able to actually reach that deep sleep. In terms of the OAE emission, the time it took to do this is on average 4 minutes, so 3 times less, but as little as 3 minutes and as maximum 6 minutes. And so the huge time difference between the OAE and the AABR, so, thinking about, can we just do one of them? Some international newborn hearing screening programs only use one, and many of them will use the OAE because it is not as labor intensive, it is quick, and therefore it is cheap in terms of return on investment. The simple and rapidness of this assessment screener is the most popular component. The other thing to know is that the AABR, assesses not the hair cell functioning in the cochlea, but it assesses the response from the cochlea in terms of how it responds to sound, which is then part of the brain. It assesses the functioning of the auditory nerve, obviously, that carries the sound to the brain, which then makes the response, and the brain stem. So one cannot compare the two to say which is the better one, because they assess different things. But one can look at time to cost ratio, and in terms of the equipment, facilities, and resources that the country or the organization has, to really think through. There is no easy answer to this. But one of the world specialists in the field, her name is Christy Yoshinaga-Itano. And when I was talking to Christy about our newborn screening program that we started at Netcare, she said if she had to ever be pushed, she would probably, if she had to choose just one, it would be the OAE, because there is a value in being able to do more babies on a day than less. And when being compared with efficient screening, so now this is not just kind of regular, but when there are efficient pediatric newborn screeners that are screening with the OAE and the AABR, the OAE always has a higher failure rate, because it relies on the tiny little bubba and only the hair cell functioning, which is impacted on by the vernix. And obviously the echo then is impacted by the hair cell functioning. The AABR has a lower level of false negatives in terms of the screening. However, when looking at both of them, in terms of the diagnosis at the end, there wasn't such a significant difference. So definitely both extremely valuable. And there are some organizations, some companies now that are doing combination equipment that I can't really speak to because I'm not a technical person. But definitely test different things. Both are valuable. And I am going to show you the screening pathway where you can see where we slot those in. I then also want to just talk about the other ways that young infants and children's hearing can be tested, because in places where they do not have newborn hearing screening, sometimes these are used, and we just need to know if there is value in them. So on the top left, there is the behavioral observation audiometry, which really is what typically we have seen regular doctors do. The GP, if you go to the ped, they'll literally grab their key and they'll shake the key. And then if the child turns, that's literally what happened to me when I went to my pediatrician for the 6-week checkup. And so that's literally what they would say. That's behavioral observation. Child turned, therefore they can hear. But typically, if this is done responsibly, the audiologist would be presenting sounds in a whole lot of different frequencies, and would then often, be, going closer and further behind. And usually this does not initially require any earphones or sound. It's really just to see the surround sound and what the child can hear just at a basic observation level. At the next level, it would then also include the little earphones and probes that could then just check per ear. Many people would say that the child needs to be at least 18 months for this. But if you are a specialist pediatric audiologist and you know babies, we have an expert, I can never remember his surname, but our expert is a retired little old man in Utah, America, and he can do behavioral observation with babies as young as 4 months with almost 100% accuracy in terms of the first level of screening and identifying that there's something wrong. On the right-hand side is the VRA, the visual response audiometry. Here the child needs to be a little bit older because one provides the stimulus, the sound, and then you give them a little yay, something to look at that makes them feel happy. And then the child starts learning, and that once they hear a sound, they're expecting the little person to jump up and down. Once they hear a sound, they're expecting the little puppet or the little dog or the little thing to jump up and down. Eventually, when the sound comes in, the child will look at something, and then they must have heard something. So the VRA, it's kind of highly skilled. The person that does the assessment also needs to know how children work, and that children show different ways of seeing sound. It's not always play audiometry, definitely for slightly older children, but should be able to be done anything from above 18 months to 2 years old. One should start being able to working with children. And in early intervention, we start often priming little kids to understand the game, but that's when a sound is given, little earphones are placed onto the ear, and the child is able to then, they hold their little block, and as soon as they hear it, they come into a little container. They pick up another little block, they listen. If they hear it, they put it in. And so it becomes a game. But the skill for the audiologist is they are assessing children at all different frequency levels, because we don't want to know what the child can hear at only one monotone. We want to know high and low frequencies, and then it's about loud and soft. And so this is one of the reasons children have to come back again so many times when their hearing is screened. And then pure tone audiometry, obviously, for children that are much older. Another important assessment, which is frequently included into the battery of the AABR, the ABR, would be the tympanogram. So the tympanogram, particularly the high frequency tympanogram, is also a very similar probe to that of the OAE. It's popped in the little ear and a puff of air gets sent through the little ear canal. Let's go back to the picture there. And there, that little eardrum, once the sound goes through the ear canal, the little eardrum and the way that it reverberates and moves is an indication of the function and the structure of the eardrum, because we want it to be vibrating at a certain tempo. If it is very sloppy, or in other words, if it vibrates very wildly, there could potentially be a hole in it. If it doesn't vibrate at all and it's very, very hard and it doesn't, the tympanogram would be a flat line. It shows that the eardrum cannot move. It cannot vibrate, which means something is preventing it. Either it's scarred, or there is blockage, or there's a lot of liquid that is preventing it from moving. So the high frequency tympanogram is also a really important one. It's not unanimously agreed upon, but a lot of the younger, newer newborn hearing screening programs are saying, if possible, to bring in the high frequency tympanogram, not immediately, but in one of the steps going forward. And like I said, I'll be sharing a little bit about that going further. Like I said earlier, one of the reasons we do newborn hearing screening is to make sure that we get that identification and diagnosis early, and that the early intervention is therefore getting the hearing aid on, getting some kind of an intervention so the child is able to learn to understand the sound they're getting, that there's some form of professional in the environment, whether it's a speech therapist, audiologist, or a speech therapist and an audiologist, that can help put fundamentals, those foundational building blocks in place, so that those little ears and the auditory nerve is then being used. Because we know that, as with any muscles, if you don't use the muscle, it will atrophy. So if we don't use the auditory nerve, and the child is not getting access to sound, that auditory nerve can eventually atrophy like a little weak muscle, and it can then really stop doing its work. And so that is one of the other reasons we really do want to get sound in there as soon as we can. And then the other component of early intervention is really to make sure that there is the other support in place. It's not only the non-medical support, but it's the support that is medical plus, therapeutic plus. It is the child developmental components that no one else is focusing on primarily. All doctors and therapists understand and look at child development, but the early intervention that is offered in addition to the medical therapeutic is the child developmental early intervention, which again is fundamental. And again, you cannot start a newborn hearing screening program of any kind if there is no expertise or some form of intervention in place to support the child and the family. And in terms of supporting them, we know it starts as close to birth as possible, and it's always family-centered, not child-centered. It takes place in the child's natural environment and is unbiased. Children always, child and family always form part of the group. So if there is going to be newborn hearing screening program, we know that the audiologist plays a significant role, as does the pediatrician. I think it's important for us to remember that in South Africa, we don't have people that are qualified as pediatric audiologists, but internationally, people that are doing newborn hearing screening and involved in newborn hearing screening programs are specialist pediatric audiologists, very often with masters and PhDs in audiology, pediatric audiology. The other fundamental person that's playing a role is obviously the pediatrician and the ENT. So you have your medical team around the child, which are all going to play a key role. And in order to set up a newborn hearing screening program, the communication really needs to be strong. And to then consider putting in place these type of things, how many of these stakeholders are in place in the country or the region that you're trying to start a newborn hearing screening program. Having them all available is the golden best standard. Golden standard doesn't necessarily have to be in place, but there are some fundamental things that need to be in place and can be shared, rented out to the other stakeholders, but there needs to be some form of holistic plan in order to do screening. So I'm going to go back to the ear. So what we want to know, remember, when we're working with tiny bubbies in the NICU, the ICU, as well as in well baby clinics, their tiny little ears are small. There is typically vernix in the ears. However, in terms of natural birth, so when you're now looking at the bubbies, children that have had natural birth, when they come through the birth canal, there is often the type of pressure. That's why the birth was designed to be this way. The pressure when they come out of the birth canal often pushes out and gets rid of much of the excess vernix, whereas bubbies that are delivered through Caesar have much more vernix in their little ears, and it stays longer, but there's very often an attempt to try and suction, obviously, through their little nose. But vernix is one of the biggest preventers and barriers to effective newborn hearing screening is the vernix. The second thing that we wanted to just remind ourselves, I'm going to just go back to the first page because I want you to look at these tiny little bubbies. The second thing that is potentially a barrier in setting it up is the time of discharge from hospital. So very often, like I said, in public hospitals in South Africa, mothers are being discharged a mere 2 to 4 hours post-birth. Newborn hearing screening cannot occur at such an early stage. And then one needs to think, when we set in place newborn hearing programs, can we as a developing country follow newborn hearing screening protocols? Or do we put in newborn hearing screening protocols that do not necessarily happen pre-discharge? So some babies in public health will be discharged later because they're in the NICU. They've been sent to the NICU for infection or complications. Those little babies can be screened because they'll be discharged later. But any screening typically before 36 hours can be quite challenging, and very often will have a false negative, meaning the child will fail the newborn screening because that little echo, that little sound that goes to the cochlea, doesn't come back with an echo if there's a lot of vernix in, because the sound cannot then travel conductively. One of the other things you need to note is when these little tiny babies are in the NICU, that sometimes babies can become deaf in hospital. So we know that babies are potentially born with hearing loss, which is genetic. It could be because of complications during birth, complications during pregnancy, illness during pregnancy, CMV, the cytomegalovirus, German measles, and quite a few other little viruses. But some babies are born typical, and these babies might actually pass the newborn hearing screening and then have a complication and go to ICU. Now, in the ICU, these little bubbies sometimes go into incubators, and there is research that shows that the opening and closing of incubators for those tiny little ears can actually cause some form of hearing loss because of the banging, even if it's done quietly, the banging and the pressure of that incubator opening and closing, if it's not done extremely carefully with the not the most modern incubators that are slightly quieter, can cause hearing damage. The second thing that can cause hearing damage in the hospital is the medication that is given to a little bubby, if it's ototoxic medication, and provision of oxygen. Either too much or too little can cause blindness or vision in various ways. So we don't only consider doing newborn hearing screening for children because of the fact that they could be born with hearing loss, but they can also acquire the hearing loss in hospital. So then for us to consider, when we think about newborn screening, there are two things to consider. Do we do universal newborn screening, or do we consider doing what we call high risk, the NICU babies? So if we were to do universal newborn screening, universal then indicates that we screen all babies that are born at this particular place, whether they are black or white, rich or poor, in Well Baby Clinic or in the NICU. High risk screening is if you decide, we are going to just take the risk, let all our well babies get discharged, and we will only focus on the babies in the NICU. And like I said before, that is a standard practice that a lot of developing countries have done because they're trying to save money, they're trying to make it doable. However, remembering that in the NICU, very often babies that have a hearing loss in the NICU have acquired the deafness because of the NICU, but then you'll miss the babies that are born that are genetically impacted and caused, and those that are caused by other type of complications during birth and during pregnancy, if there is no other risk factor. So if this hearing loss is truly invisible, and the baby's in the Well Baby Clinic, and we choose to do only high risk screening, we'll miss all those other children. Yes. What I want to talk about now is I'm going to change the screen because I want to show you what we've done at the Netcare Hospital, because this is probably the screening pathway. Gillian, can you just confirm that you are seeing the hearing pathway now that I'm showing?
Yeah, we can see it.
Beautiful. Okay. So like I said, this is the pathway that we've developed for Netcare. So and we'll be publishing it, and then you'll be able to reference it perfectly. So what is done is, before you even offer newborn screening, there has to be an ethical consent given or consent declined. It's really, really important that if consent is not given, there is a structure and system in place. So you'll see now when you look at a pathway like this for newborn screening, the pathway doesn't only think of the hearing, the screening that is done, but the hearing screening that isn't done. So then ethical responsibility, if you're offering newborn screening and a family chooses not to take it, there is still an ethical dilemma of the support you give the family, of the implications of the decision that they've made not to take the screening. Again, it is not done to scare, it is not done as a oh my word, but it is important that the families understand what the screening is ahead of time. So the information that is given needs to be provided in a really good way, and it needs to be provided in a non-biased way. So we can't be providing it in a fear-invoking way. We can't provide it in a, oh my word, this is important because the child needs to speak and be normal. But it's kind of the information that is given, consent given, consent declined, and then to make sure that we have a plan for all those babies and families where the consent was declined. If consent is given, number one, the OA screening. Like I said, this takes usually 3 to 4 minutes per ear. Typically on a good day, it could take maybe less. On a bad day, slightly more. Or one just comes back if baby's niggly, but the baby has to be still. Now, we talk about refer or pass, but what we've often started doing in Netcare is to talk about the baby did not pass as opposed to refer, because refer just sounds too soft. And sometimes parents actually don't then understand the implications of, if your baby referred, it means they failed and they've got to come back. But failed is also too harsh. So the baby can refer or not pass, either one ear or both, and that is both important. Unilateral refer or bilateral refer, or they can pass bilaterally. This is a very significant decision that screening programs need to make. Do you react and respond to only bilateral refers, or do you respond to unilateral refers as well? Some programs where finances are tight, where they're wanting to only focus on high risk and red flag, they will choose only to intervene and do follow-ups with the child with bilateral. So that is something that needs to be discussed and thought through very ethically for you. When a child passes bilaterally, now we're also again looking at when a child doesn't fail, they pass, but one also then gives the parent information about future, because we don't want parents, if the child passes newborn screening, there is a risk of the parent then having what they call that false sense of security that, and I'm nearly finished, Jill, and then people can ask questions. That false sense of security is my baby's had newborn screening, therefore my child is not deaf. And then the negative of newborn screening can also then give parents a false sense of security. So there is also that responsibility to give them information for future. If the baby refers, one logs it, and one schedules a second screening, definitely no later than 4 to 6 weeks after that. 4 weeks definitely, because it then allows the vernix to totally clear. If there was anything else complicated in those little ears, it gives time to clear, but no later than 6 weeks, and the second OA screening is done. We talk about here at this stage, if the baby is a complex baby and is in the NICU, they could, at the first screening, get an OAE and an AABR, or one of those dual machines. And then if the child refers or fails after the second screening, at that point, and it's in dotted lines, the high frequency TIMP, because it's not agreed. It's not agreed upon, and many practices don't have high frequency TIMPs if they're only screening practices. So again, there are bigger issues to discuss in terms of who you'll be using to do the screening, the type of equipment, and it's not just the OAE first screen. There are definitely layers that need to be followed on. After the second screening, if the child is passed, we again make sure that there is an indication of child development milestones and what they need to check out and observe, and that newborn and that the screening then happens on an annual basis after that, unless there are any questions come at any time. Once the second screening and the high frequency TIMPs are done, if there is an abnormal high frequency TIMP, we then need to send child for follow-ups to the ENT or the pediatrician, because it typically then means there's some kind of a complication in the middle ear, which then means one has to have a logging system that will then flag 2 weeks later to then do a follow-up to make sure that the middle ear stuff, which the high frequency TIMP has picked up, has been resolved, so that then can be a full diagnostics. If the high frequency TIMP is fine and the middle ear is fine and the eardrum is fine, one then goes forward onto full diagnostics. Now, the full diagnostics has to be done by a qualified audiologist, again, preferably someone who's got experience in pediatrics, a pediatric audiologist. And this is where one can confirm then if there's normal hearing or confirm the hearing loss. After the hearing loss is confirmed, internationally, the best practice is that then there is a little plan put in place, not to control the family, not to manage the family, but to give the families the options and the responsible pathways and journey ahead of who their stakeholders are, who the people will be involved, and what can be expected, including the non-medical early intervention, which in South Africa is high hopes. The last thing I want to leave you with is, again, the type of question of which assessment is best if we need to invest in one. Is it the OAE, the AABR, or the tympanogram? And I want to state quite clearly that I am not a Luddite, which means I do not fear technology or I do not hate technology. But technology is not the be-all and end-all, and technology is not the answer. So because we have AABRs that are amazing, automated, you plug it in and does everything and it gives you the graph, it doesn't mean the AABR or the ABR gives you an unquestionable result that is 100% accurate. Sometimes these automated amazing things can be wrong, can give you some form of error because it's not assessing certain parts and it doesn't give you the whole picture. So the final message when we're talking about newborn hearing screening, which then moves on to the pathway of getting it diagnosed and intervene, is that screening and hearing tests of little infants and babies is literally like building a puzzle. Audiologists do various tests and they do them again and again at the different frequencies and different loudnesses and softness, because they're putting together a puzzle, a picture of what this baby looks like, which includes the OAE, the AABR, the tympanogram, then the observational. And then once the hearing aids are put on, they're then again adapting as they put together this picture of all the different puzzle pieces, and one cannot build a full picture of what this baby looks like from newborn screening in those early months if one doesn't have all of the puzzle pieces together. So let me end there. That's about as much as I can say as fast as I can speak. Over to you, Gillian.
Yeah, Claudine, thank you so much. To start my video. Thanks so much for that, for covering such a lot and making it all so accessible and straightforward. So if there are questions, please raise your hand, and I'm going to ask Ruth if she's still with us. I was chatting to Ruth at the beginning of the session, and she's an educational psychologist in Zimbabwe, and was describing the tragedy of what happens when early hearing loss is not detected. Ruth, do you have a specific question for Claudine?
Hi. No, I don't. I'm not sure here, but I don't think they do early hearing screening at birth, on principle in Zimbabwe. I think, again, like you, if they think that it is could be a possible problem or there's a risk, they would do it. And I know also, exactly as you described, when with my own children with pediatricians, it was that, jingle some keys and then see. So what's really interesting, we generally say to parents, whether a bit OTT, just do a hearing screening. And it's incredible how many children I have found even just have gluea. And that obviously from my perspective is going to impact on their spelling and reading. And what's it's tragic, because what I'm seeing a lot of is that children, it's almost like they will come to me older and they'll have what I call a paucity of language. They just don't have words. It's not that they can't speak. And 9 times out of 10, if you go back to their developmental history, you will see that they had a speech delay, or there was something, or grommets or something. And when I see the impact later in high school on their academics, it's tragic, because I think it might have often just been a very, like that, gluea or something that could have been sorted out. But I mean, we have the same limitations as you, as financial and, medical aids and all the rest of it. So it's always going to be the people who have privilege and money who are going to actually have access to it. But I think there definitely needs to be an education of it, and we talk about it a lot with the teachers and with parents. Yeah.
I'm going to pick up on what you said there, Ruth. In addition to the ethical dilemma of screening, if you don't have early intervention, there is also the ethical dilemma that if you've got a screening program, that you have to follow up with the losses. In other words, if a baby fails on screening, you cannot then just go, oh, they failed and this,
Absolutely.
So that's called the loss to follow up. And then it's those babies that then typically fall within that category. And, if you had gluea during the week that you learned fractions are always a problem for you. Life. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
There's a question here from Carolyn. Firstly, she says, thank you to you, Claudine. And what is the percentage contribution of infectious illnesses, such as neonatal sepsis, hearing loss, in comparison to genetics and other causes?
Yeah, great question, Caroline. We know that 50% of the causes are unknown. So we assume that that 50% are genetic. Okay, that means 50% we usually know what the cause is. Infectious illnesses, I mean, this is just a thumbs up just from the data that I've seen, maybe 20%, maybe 25%. But that I'm saying under correction from just what I've seen with a couple of thousand babies I've seen. We're doing the analysis to make it more clear. But those ones very often are the ones that can be prevented. If parents had known about certain things, and very often with infectious diseases, it comes with additional disabilities.
Carolyn, I hope that answers your question, or you want to ask a follow-up question. I would like to ask Claudine, you've been involved in the neonatal screening program at a private health chain, and you mentioned to me, I think something like 80,000 babies had been screened. So it seems in the private sector, universal newborn screening is a reality in the private sector. And I'm interested in knowing how successful was that screening program and what percentage of children actually did not pass the initial screening and needed follow-up. Do you have any of that data?
Yeah, extremely successful once there is buy-in. I do think it is possible to do in the public health sector. I don't think it's impossible to do, because really it's typically related to staffing. If one has got the staff to do it, one can do definitely. So it's not necessarily tied to the public health sector, the private health. The percentage of failures should typically not be more than 10 to 15% in a newish establishing newborn screening program. So we know that if there are more than 50% of newborns that are failing screening, there is either a mistake in terms of your settings and the equipment you're using, or it's an inexperienced screener. So that is what one is aiming to. One also doesn't want to have less than 10% of the babies that are not failing newborn screening. Because then if every baby passes screening in some of the hospitals that you kind of looking at, it's like, then you also know there's a problem, because you're expecting that level. And so then you're kind of looking at, for brand new programs, it could maybe go up to like 18-20%, but anything above that is a red flag in terms of the quality of screening. What we should be seeing in South Africa is that every one of those babies are then followed up at second screen. Diagnosis should be, in terms of the research and what they're showing us out there, that it should be 2 to 4 babies at minimum per 1,000. But in a country where you have the most amazing level of audiologists and practices, it is very often hard for audiologists to want to share once they've diagnosed a baby. So that pathway is hard to track. So if there's any opportunity for you to set up a hearing screening program, you need to make that a requirement. Because again, ethically, you cannot screen babies unless we then know what the outcome was, so that one then can put things in place, or else they maybe fail the second screen without that. So at the moment, we're busy writing up that, so you'll see those stats very soon. But and very often you'll see in certain locations, if there's been a spate of German measles, or there is a specific area that had an influx of CMV mummies. So there is sometimes a higher look, and that's why you need what we call a data management program. So that is one of the other requirements in setting in place a newborn hearing screening program. You have to have some form of data management so that there is ethical follow-up, and then also just to know the reason why I focused so much on the consent. And when parents don't give consent, they need to know the consequences, or when a baby fails the first screen and is not followed up. In South Africa, and I don't know, maybe Ruth will tell us in other countries, but in South Africa at the moment, pediatricians are held liable and gynecologists are held liable for up to 20 years. So if someone is offering newborn screening, whether you're in your private capacity as an audiologist at a public or private hospital, and in 19 years, the family discover, oh my word, my child is deaf, and they might discover it was genetic, they can think back and then go, well, I actually think they didn't screen my baby at birth. I remember they offer, and they can actually then start a case and sue the practitioner or the hospital or the pediatrician or gynae. And so it's making sure that, again, in that data management system, you're logging the fact that if a parent doesn't want newborn screening, that they know why they don't want it and understand the implications, because gynecologists, pediatricians, and now even our therapists, audiologists are open to more liability for being sued when there is a disability identified later. And that's people dealing with grief that is unresolved, which would have then been prevented from newborn screening.
Claudina, I have one last question, and I'm looking at this from a public health perspective. If newborn screening is to become universal in this country, you've got to think of babies that are not born in hospitals, or babies that are born at clinics, babies that are get to start after 2 to 4 hours, that your newborn hearing screening is most likely then to happen at a well baby clinic, if you want to get universal screening. So if it's happening at a well baby clinic, how easy is it to do an OAE at a well baby clinic? And do you have to have an audiologist to do an OAE if audiologists aren't available at clinic level?
Okay, good question. So two things. We know that particularly in Africa, in addition to the antiretroviral AIDS rollout. And so that is one of the best ways to put in place newborn screening if one isn't able to catch them before discharge, or they're home babies, or they were born elsewhere, at that first vaccination time, which is at 6 weeks. 6 weeks babies are still young enough that one potentially do the OAE when they're sleeping, and so then you prime the parents that they need to come, you feed, and then once they're sleeping. So that would definitely then be the recommendation. And then Bola Olusanya in Nigeria has done quite a lot of research where she's also looked at that first vaccination engagement at 6 weeks is really a good one. And despite what many audiologists would like in terms of business process, anyone can actually become a newborn screener. They just need good training, but they need to be overseen and mentored, overseen and managed by a qualified audiologist, and ideally someone who's got experience in pediatrics. And so one can put in place newborn hearing screening with screeners that you train and that you monitor really well, and then you do quality checks. So when Christy Yoshinaga put hers in place, they used retired people that were sitting at home doing nothing. And it was kind of one of those mental health kind of like, would you like to get involved? Would you like to do something? And they were doing newborn screening. And there's some local schools that are doing screening with parents. And so no, you don't, but you definitely need an audiologist overseeing monitoring the quality. And of course, they'd have done the training before.
Claudine, I want to thank you so much for giving us so much useful and practical information. And I think particularly is putting it on the map that if we don't do newborn screening, or we aren't aware of the importance of newborn screening, what disadvantage we're placing that child at from early on. And this is something that is so easy to prevent. So something like an intervention such as early newborn screening, I think, has that potential exactly to give kids the best start in life. So and if we as people interested in childhood disability are looking at advocacy and looking also to what extent can we prevent it, something like newborn screening must certainly be on the horizon of everyone involved in child health. So I thank you very much for your time today, and I thank you to our participants. Yeah, and I see there's some in the chat. Ismail, thank you. And Claudine has responded to you. And I just want to say to our participants, our audience, thank you so much. Two things just to say: if you membership of SA Child, if you are a member, you'll get your free CPD points. They can be they'll be loaded up as the year goes on. So if you're not yet a member of SA Child, please just go to our website and click on the membership button. You have to renew your registration each year. We don't have an automated system. And then you have to also just do your payment each year. And it's 500 Rand if you're in South Africa, 250 Rand if you're a student or outside South Africa. And if you're a person with a lived experience of childhood onset disability, it is free. And lastly, to tell you that our next webinar is going to be on Wednesday, the 31st of May at the same time. And there we're going to have a discussion, a listening and sharing session, which means, and it's about transition. So looking at what happens to young people as they then become adults with childhood onset disabilities, and listening to them and the journeys they've traveled and what it is that we can learn from that will improve our practice with the kids we work with. So with that, bid you all farewell. Thanks for joining us. Enjoy the long weekend. And thanks once again to Claudine. Bye.
Okay. Have a nice long weekend.